The first thing is the speed of light. Muslims believe that angels are created from light, and the angels communicate the affairs of God which they get from what is known as a preserved tablet in outer space. And the speed at which they travel to and from this tablet, it turns out to actually be the speed of light. In the Quran, Surah 32 verse 5, it says, Allah rules the cosmic affairs from the heavens to the earth. Then this affair travels to him a distance in one day, at a measure of 1,000 years of what you count. Hence, in one day, the angels will travel a distance of 1,000 years according to the lunar calendar, because that's what Muslims counted at that time. The belief is that God is saying that the angels travel in one day the same distance that the moon travels in 12,000 lunar orbits. 12,000 lunar orbits or Earth days equals the speed of light. Now, science shows that. Now, the atmosphere protects us is the next thing. So the atmosphere protects Earth from radiation and meteorites. Now, this is also portrayed in the Quran 1400 years ago. In the Quran, Surah 21 verse 32, it says, "And we made the sky a protective shield, and they turn away from its sign." The next scientific miracle in the Quran is the female bees are the worker bees. So worker bees are actually all females. Now, the Quran refers to bees that generate honey as females. So listen to this. In the Quran, Surah 16 verses 68 to 69, it says, "And your Lord revealed to the bees, build your hives in mountains, trees, and in what they build. Then eat from every fruit and follow your Lord's enslaved paths. From its bellies exists drink of different color, in it healing for man." So in Arabic, the word eat or kuli is for females, and that's used in the Quran. And the term follow a path is the word usluki in Arabic, and that refers to females as well. As also the term its bellies is butuniha, and that's also used for females. The Quran also mentions hearing before seeing. So this is what I mean. So hearing is one of the first senses to develop. Now, this is only known in recent history, and it's also mentioned in the Quran. The Quran, Surah 76 verses 2, it says, "We created man from a fertilizing sperm to test him, and we made him hearing and seeing." Also, the Quran, Surah 23:78, it says, "It is he who produced for you the hearing and the eyesight and the feelings, but little gratitude you show." So the Quran always refers to the hearing before the seeing, which turned out to be the actual order of human development in the womb. Flight comes in at number 6. So the Quran is also believed by Muslims to have foretold that humans someday would be able to reach the sky. In Surah 29:22, it says, "You cannot escape Allah's might on earth or in the sky, and you have no protector and no savior besides Allah." Also in Surah 84:19, it says, "You will ride one layer from another layer." The word tabak in Arabic means layer in English, and from this came certain myths about flying carpets, but now the flying aircrafts that go up layer upon layer are what we know today. Also, sound waves. According to the University of Washington, the original sound waves were not temperature variations, but they were actual real sound waves spreading around the universe. Now, in the Quran, Surah 41 verse 11 indicates this, and it says, "Then he directed himself to the heaven when it was smoke, and then said to it and to the earth, 'Come willingly or by force.' They said, 'We do come willingly.'" So the heaven replying back implies that the heaven had a voice, which would mean it emitted a sound wave. Another miracle Muslims point to is high altitudes affect your breathing. As altitude increases, atmospheric pressures and oxygen levels in the atmosphere actually decrease, which eventually gets to a point where we can no longer breathe. Now, we all know this. The higher you go, the harder it is to breathe. Now, in the Quran, Surah 6 verse 125, it says this, "Those whom Allah wants to guide, he opens their chest to Islam, and those whom he wants to leave astray, he makes their chest tight and constricted, as if they are ascending to the sky." Bones forming before muscles is also another miracle. Apparently, the first formation of actual bones happens in the jawbone at day 41, and about 3 days later, that's when the associated muscles are formed. And in the Quran, Surah 23 verse 14, it says, "Then we develop the semen into a leech, then we develop the leech into a lump, then we develop the lump into bones, then we clothe the bones with flesh, then we produce it into another creature. Most blessed is Allah, the best of creators. Number 2, now we look at the part of the brain responsible for lying. So for centuries, everybody thought that the frontal part of the human brain was responsible for sight, because of course it's at the front of your head. But we know now that the part responsible for vision is actually at the back of the brain. So if you fall back and hit the back of your head, it could affect your sight or make your eyes go cross-eyed. But now science shows us that the frontal part of our brain, or the prefrontal cortex, is responsible for forming intelligent thoughts like creating lies. And Muslims quote the Quran, Surah 96 verse 16, that says, "A lying, sinful forehead," which indicates that lying is happening in the front of your head. Now, number 1, we have planets, stars, and all of the celestial bodies are actually moving. For centuries, it was believed that the Earth was fixed and the sun and the moon and other planets and the stars and all that revolved around the Earth. But an interesting passage from the Quran that the Muslims point to is Surah 39 verses 5, and it says, "Allah created the heavens and the earth in truth. He overlaps the night over the day and overlaps the day over the night and enslaves the sun and the moon. All move to a pre-recorded destiny." Miracle number 10 is the color of water. Years ago, people thought that water was just transparent. No one thought that the color of water could actually turn black. But scientists have actually discovered a new characteristic of water. At a higher pressure, the water molecules become half liquid and half solid. Now, what's called superionic water forms in higher temperatures and pressures. It's very dark and thicker than, well, water. And the Quran says that in the heat of hellfire, water actually looks really dark, like tar. It's mentioned in the Quran in Surah 18 verse 29. It says, "We have prepared for the unjust a fire whose curtains will hem them in. And when they cry for relief, they will be relieved with water like tar, which scald their faces." Number 9 is the process of photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is a process used by plants and other organisms to convert light energy into energy that they can use. And in the Quran, Surah 18 verse 35, it says, "And cite for them the parable of the present life. It is like water that we send down from the sky. The plants of the earth absorb it, but then it becomes debris scattered by the winds." Now, photosynthesis converts carbon dioxide and water into oxygen and sugar. Most of the water evaporates back into the atmosphere, which the term debris points to in the Quran. Gardens being therapeutic come in at number 8. Reductions in stress, as well as tiredness, depression, anger, anxiety, have all been documented when people actually go into gardens. Engagement with gardens has increasingly been recognized as not only a cost-effective health intervention, but also a treatment or occupational therapy for those with psychological health issues, and this is done with what is called horticultural therapy. Now, this statement comes from the National Center of Biotechnology Information. Gardening is beneficial for health, a meta-analysis published in 2016. And the Quran, Surah 27 verse 60, it says, "Or who created the heavens and the earth and rains down water from the sky for you? With it produces joyful gardens whose trees you could not produce." Now, the term bahjat means joy or delight in Arabic, and that's the word used. So in this verse, gardens are actually bringing joy or delight, and since today's gardens are being prescribed as a natural antidepressant of sorts, Muslims view this as a miracle. Next up, we have meteorites. So when a meteor enters the atmosphere, the meteor heats up so much that it starts to shine, and then the air burns the meteor, and poof, nothing is left, right? In the Quran, Surah 52 verses 44, it says, "Even if they were to see lumps of the sky falling down, they would say, a mass of clouds." So people would think that they're clouds because of the ashes that are left after the meteor gets like, and Muslims say, yeah, that's a miracle. Miracle number 6 is female spiders spinning webs. It's generally accepted that adult female spiders spin the webs while adult males do not, outside of looking to mate. This is according to Speely. Do only female spiders build webs? published in 2019, this year. And in the Quran, Surah 29 verse 41, it says, "The likeness of those who take to themselves protectors other than Allah is that of the spider. It builds a house, but the most fragile of houses is the spider's house, if they only knew." Now when it says those who take, the term in Arabic is ittakatha, and that's for males. Now ittakatat is for females, and the Quran uses the female version. At number 5, we look at the mountains having roots as well as floating. So the highest point of the earth is in the Himalayas at Mount Everest, standing at 8.8 kilometers high. Now this mountain has actually 250 kilometers of deep roots. This was recorded in Life Science Depth of Himalayan Mountain Roots Revealed back in the year 2010. Now the Quran in 2 places says mountains as pegs, as well as it says, "and mountains he anchored." So pegs are used to hold a tent or something in place, and pegs have a part of it above the ground as well as another part that's into the ground, and the Arabic word means anchored, and this is actually a term that applies to ships floating on water, like when they're anchored to land. So similarly, this is how mountains or other landforms really actually float above a semi-molten asthenosphere. Yeah, Google that term, asthenosphere. Female ants come in at number 4. So check this. All male ants have wings. All worker ants are females, and all ants that don't have wings are females. Now in the Quran, Surah 27 verse 18, it mentions this: "Until when they came upon the valley of ants, and the ants said, 'O ants, enter your homes so that you do not be crushed by Solomon and his soldiers while they do not feel it.'" Now for the word said, kala is for males and kalat is for females. Now the Quran of course uses kalat for females, so if the ants actually had wings, it would have just flown away. However, they didn't have an option in this context in the Quran, but rather they had to go and hide into their home. So Muslims believe that the ant is correctly addressed as a female in this passage, which they identify as being another miracle. Number 3, the universe is expanding. So scientists today do not know what dark energy actually is, but they do know, however, that it exists and it's causing the entire universe to expand. In the Quran, Surah 51 verse 47, it says, "And the heaven we built with craftsmanship, and we are still expanding." The Quran also said that everything is made of pairs, and today we know that all matter is actually in pairs. So matter and antimatter, electrons and positrons, and so on. And in the Quran, Surah 36 verse 36, it says, "Glory to him who created in pairs all things that the land produces, and their own kind, and other things of that they have no knowledge of." And finally, at number 1, continental drift. So back in the year 2014, the National Geographic published "How do we know the continents are moving?" And this is what they said. 50 years ago, continental drift was a fringe hypothesis rejected by most geologists. Today, the theory of plate tectonics is universally accepted as true and unifies one separate areas of geology under one grand banner. There are mountains of evidence that plate tectonics had taken place in our planet's past. Now, the Muslims point to Quran 27 verses 88, and it says, "You see the mountains and think they are firmly fixed, but they are moving away just like the clouds are moving away." Let's take a look. Starting at number 10, Surah Nuh, also known as Noah. In Surah Nuh, which is the 71st chapter of the Quran, it has 28 verses in this chapter, and that makes the difference between these two numbers 43, as 71 take away 28 equals 43. And something that Muslims point to is that it turns out that the prophet Nuh, or Noah, is mentioned in the Quran exactly 43 times. Besides this, there are 43 chapters following Surah Nuh until the end of the Quran, and these 43 chapters contain no mention of Noah at all. Also, the chapters of the Quran that do mention the prophet Nuh, they're 28 in total, which is the exact number of verses in Surah Nuh. Number 9 leads us to the math miracle in Surah Al-Naml. In Surah Al-Naml, which is the 27th chapter of the Quran, there's a total of 93 verses in this chapter. Now this chapter begins with apparent random letters, and in Surah 21 verses 1, this is what it says: Ta, Sin. These are the verses of the Quran and a clear book. Now, the term Ta and Sin, which are written as single unit and pronounced together as Ta Sin, the first letter appears throughout the chapter 27 times, which also, of course, is the chapter number, and also the second apparently random letter appears 93 times, which is the exact number of verses in that chapter. Surah Al-Nahl comes in at number 8. Another thing to note is that the code of 16 found in Surah Al-Nahl, which is in the 16th chapter of the Quran, there's a note that the male bees, known as drones, have 16 chromosomes, while the female worker bees as well as the queen bees have 16 pairs of chromosomes. On top of that, another thing to note is that the queen bees emerge from the egg in 16 days, and the number of verses in this chapter is 128, which is a multiple of 16, because 16 times 8 is 128. And of course, half of the number 128 is 64, which is another multiple of 16. And researchers have found that 64 of this chapter's verses contain the name of Allah, while 64 of them do not contain the name of Allah. Let's look at the math miracle now in Surah 96. First verses of the Quran that Muslims believe were revealed to the Prophet Muhammad were the first 5 verses of chapter 96, and in the Quran that says, "Recite in the name of your Lord who created man from a clinging substance. Recite, and your Lord is most generous, who taught by the pen, taught man that which he knew not." That's specifically found in Surah 96 verses 1 to 5. Now, the name of the chapter is the Alaq, which scholars have described as an early stage of a human being inside of the womb. And now the Arabic word Alaq, which translates to clinging substance, is the 9th word in the Arabic surah. Now, the 9th prime number in math is 23, which is the exact number of DNA chromosome pairs found in humans. The miracle at number 6 involves prime numbers. Prime numbers, which have confused mathematicians for many years. They make up a really strong and recurring key element throughout the Quran. Another prominent key element in the Quran includes specific words and numbers such as 114, which is the total number of chapters in the Quran. So I'll probably leave some of those for part 2. There's a whole lot of math miracles associated with the Quran. Continuing now with number 5, let's look at the math miracle in Surah 83. So in 2 places, the 83rd Surah speaks of numerically structured books. Now, the term numerically structured books in Arabic is the term Kitabun Markum. And these verses are believed to be evidence of God encoding the books and evidence of God being involved in the mathematical systems. And we read in the Quran, Surah 83 verses 7 to 9, it says, "Indeed, the book of the wicked is Sijin." Do you know what Sijin is? A numerically structured book. The math miracle involving opposites comes next. In Surah 89 verses 3, it says, "And by the even number and the odd number." So, as it's noted in the Quran, the number of angels and devils were both mentioned 88 times. Heat and coolness are both mentioned 4 times. Summer and winter are both mentioned once. Woman and man were both mentioned 24 times. Worry and assurance were mentioned 13 times each, as well as belief and disbelief are both mentioned 9 times. There's also a math miracle found in the 9th chapter of the Quran. So the first statement in the Quran is, "In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful." By the way, that consists of 19 Arabic letters known as the Basmala. It's actually the preface of every chapter except chapter 9 in the Quran. And although it is missing from chapter 9, when you look 19 chapters later, the Basmala happens twice in the Quran. So chapter 27 has a statement at its beginning, and in the verse 30 it says, "Indeed, it is from Solomon," and indeed it reads, "In the name of Allah, the entirely merciful, the especially merciful." So this makes a total number of times that the Basmala occurs in the Quran 114, or 19 times 6 times, which is equal to the number of chapters in the Quran. Number 2 involves a miracle about many different numbers in the Quran. So yes, there are so many different ones, and as a matter of fact, number 7 is one of the main ones that come up in the Quran. So it seems like this number has a strong relationship with the way our universe was actually created and structured according to Muslim theology, because it's believed that the earth actually has 7 layers, as well as the atmosphere atmosphere has 7 layers. It's believed that the universe has 7 different skies. This is often referred to as heavens. The sky, heavens, sometimes are used interchangeably. Also, the number of verses in the Quran that refer to the 7 skies is actually 7. And the first time the number 7 is mentioned in the Quran, it was in chapter 2, verses 29, when the Quran says, "It is He who created for you all of that which is on the earth. Then He directed Himself to the heaven, His being above all creation, and made them 7 heavens, and He is knowing of all things." And the final time the number 7 is mentioned in the Quran is in chapter 78, verses 12, where it says, "And constructed above you 7 strong heavens." And the final math miracle in this episode that I'm going to share with you has to do with the earth. So this is a very fascinating thing. Let's take a look at the number of times that the term month was mentioned in the Quran, and that is 12 times. Day is also mentioned 365 times. Sea is mentioned 32 times. Land is mentioned 13 times. And sea plus land, which is 32 plus 13, equal 45. Now, apparently modern science has only recently discovered that the following figures actually represent the exact proportions of the sea and land on Earth. So the percentage of sea is 32 over 45 times 100%, which is 71%. And the percentage of land that the Earth is made up of goes by the figure of 13 over 45 times 100, which equals 28.8, and a whole bunch of 8s follow there, and that's your percentage. So it's about 71.1% of sea makes up the Earth, as well as 28.8% of the Earth is made up of land. Right into the video, starting at number 10, here we have living things formed from water. And the Quran says, "Do those who disbelieve not see that the heavens and the earth were sewn together, and then we unstitched them, and that we made from water every living thing? So will they not then believe?" And that's taken from Surah 21 verses 30. Also in Surah 24 verses 45, it says, "Allah created every living creature from water." Geological studies have confirmed that water is not only the first and the main compound in all living things, but also it precedes the existence of all created beings. Next up at number 9, we have the duality of creation. The Quran specifically says, "And it is He who spread out the earth and set thereon mountains standing firm and flowing rivers, and the fruit of every kind He made in pairs, 2 and 2, male and female. He draws the night as a veil over the day. Behold, verily in these things are signs for those who reflect." This is taken from Surah 13 verses 3. Here we see things created in pairs. Now there's another verse in the Quran that says, "He who has made for you the earth like a carpet spread out, has enabled you to go about therein by roads and channels, and has sent down water from the sky. With it we have produced diverse pairs of plants." And that's taken from Surah 20 verses 53. The Quran has several verses like this. Another one, as an example, "Glory be to Him who created all the pairs from what the earth produces, and from themselves, and from things unknown to them." And that's taken from Surah 36 verses 36. Moving on now to number 8, we're going to be looking at the female honeybee. Now check this out. Honeybees have 3 various forms. There's a queen bee, that's the reproductive female. Then there's the drone bee, which is the male. And then the worker bees are the non-reproductive females. Each of these have their role. The non-reproductive female bee is responsible for making the honey. And that's what the Quran speaks about in Surah 16 verses 68 to 69. It says as follows, "Your Lord revealed to the bees, build dwellings in the mountains and the trees, and also in the structures which men erect. Then eat from every kind of fruit and travel the paths of your Lord, which have been made easy for you to follow. From inside them comes a drink of varying colors, containing healing for mankind. There is certainly a sign in that for people who reflect." So in this verse, the verbs build, eat, and travel, they're written in the female form in the original Arabic language. But while we're on the topic of bees and honey, we have to mention at number 7 that honey brings healing. In chapter 16 of the Quran is Surah Al-Nahl, and that is translated as the bees in English. In this chapter, specifically in verse 69, this is what it has to say. Then eat from all of the fruits and follow the ways of your Lord laid down for you. There emerges from their bellies a drink varying in colors, in which there's healing for people. Indeed, this is a sign for those who reflect. So I pretty much just read that in the previous entry, but research now shows that antibacterial and anti-inflammatory properties are found in honey. It also helps against infections and in the regrowth of tissue when our body is healing. Honey also contains antioxidants that help to prevent heart problems and cancer. Let's talk about gender at number 6. The Quran states that one's masculinity or femininity is actually created out of a drop of sperm that has been ejected. And the Quran says the following: He has created both sexes, male and female, from a drop of semen which has been ejected. That's taken from Surah 53 verses 45 to 46. And now it's widely known that human sex is determined by the male's sperm, with the female cells playing really no role in the sex determination process. Another miracle mentioned in the Quran is the alaka that clings to the uterus. Now, the following is a passage from the Quran. It says, "Then we formed the drop into an alaka and formed the alaka into a lump and formed the lump into bones and clothed the bones in flesh and then brought him into being as another creature. Glory be to Allah, the best of creators." This is taken from Surah 23 verses 14. Now, one thing to note is that the Arabic word alaka is used to describe leeches that cling to a body and feed off of the blood inside of the body. And it can be translated to mean a thing that clings to something. So comparing a leech to an embryo at the alaka stage, we can see that there's similarities between the two of them, not just in appearance, but also in function as well. And the word alaka can also be translated as blood clot. And we can see that the appearance of the embryo and its sacs during the alaka stage actually looks like a blood clot. Number 4 brings us humans formed in stages. Human reproduction, as science tells us, it actually takes place in various different stages. And the Quran also mentions this. In Surah 71, God created you in stages. Also, the Quran says He creates you in the wombs of your mothers in stages, one development after another, in 3 layers of darkness. That's taken from Surah 39 verses 6. Another pretty interesting miracle found in the Quran is about the prefrontal cortex. So check this out. The front part of the brain is called the prefrontal cortex, and it's responsible for coming up with lies. According to PubMed.gov, people who just lie, known as pathological liars, have more prefrontal white matter. And the Quran said that the disbelievers will be dragged from their lying foreheads. In the Quran, Surah 96 verses 15 to 16, we can find a passage that says this: "But no, if he does not desist, he will certainly drag him by the forelock, a lying sinful forelock." Now, this is also translated as forehead. The original Arabic word nasya in this case refers to the frontal lobe of the brain where reasoning is processed, and from there people can come up with lies. Number 2 is also very fascinating. It's talking about bones that are formed before muscles. The first formation of actual bone happens at the jawbone at around 41 days, and then about 3 days later the muscles are formed. And now, we did read the following passage at number 5 in this episode, but there is something else to notice in the passage. Just to recap, it goes as follows: "Then we formed the drop into an alaka and formed the alaka into a lump and formed the lump into bones and clothed the bones in flesh and then brought him into being as another creature. Glory be to Allah, the best of creators." So what we can also see in this passage is the sequential formation of bones and flesh. And to end this episode off, we are going to be talking about fasting and its medical benefits. The Quran does mention this in Surah 2 verses 184. It says, "O you who believe, fasting is prescribed for you as it was prescribed for those before you, that you may become righteous, for a specified number of days. But whoever among you is sick or on a journey, then a number of other days. For those who are able, a ransom of feeding a needy person. But whoever volunteers goodness, it is better for him. But to fast is best for you, if you only knew." Nowadays, we know that intermittent fasting has been linked to numerous health benefits. And some of those benefits include reducing the risk of diabetes, reducing inflammation in the body, as well as lowering your blood pressure and also balancing your weight. It, however, is recommended that you consult with a medical professional when it comes to fasting, but studies do show that yes, fasting does have many benefits. We're starting at number 10. Let's look at the origin of life. Now, water is essential for all living things. And we all know that water is a basic need for life, but in the Quran, there's a very surprising claim in it. "We made every living thing from water. Will they not believe?" And that's found in the Quran, Surah 21, verses 30. So this verse, we see that water is pointed out as the origin of life. All living things are made up of cells, and we now know that cells are mostly made up of water. For example, 80% of cytoplasm, which are the basic cell materials of a standard animal cell, is described as water in biology textbooks. Now, the fact that living things consist mostly of water was discovered only after the invention of the microscope. In the deserts of Arabia, the last thing somebody would have guessed is that life came from water. There's also a surprising claim at number 9 about iron. So iron apparently is unnatural to Earth, and it did not form on the Earth but actually came down from outer space. This is according to many scientists who believe that billions of years ago the Earth was actually struck by meteorites, and now these meteorites were actually carrying iron from distant stars that had exploded, and they landed into Earth, and then we had iron. Now in the Quran, it has this to say about iron. "We sent down iron with its great inherent strength and its many benefits for humankind." And you can find that in the Quran, Surah 57, verses 25. So the Quran uses the word "sent down" for iron. So this verse points that iron is not an earthly material, but was sent down for the benefit of humankind. Now the fact that iron came down to Earth from outer space is something which could not be known by the science of the 7th century.
The giant body crashed into the center of the planet and gave Earth its iron core.
Sky's protection comes in at number 8. Now the sky plays a very important role in protecting the Earth. The sky protects the Earth from the lethal rays of the sun. If the sky did not exist, then the sun's radiation would have killed all life on Earth. So pretty much the sky acts like a blanket wrapped around the Earth to protect it from the freezing cold of space. Now the Quran asks people to consider and ponder upon the sky in the following verse. "We made the sky a protective ceiling, and yet they are turning away from our signs." And you can find that in the Quran, Surah 21, verse is 32. Now the protective properties of the sky were discovered by scientific research conducted in the 20th century.
The sky protects the Earth from the lethal rays of the sun. If the sky did not exist, then the sun's radiation would have killed off all life on Earth.
Another surprising thing mentioned in the Quran at number 7 is the mountains. Now the Quran points our attention to a very important characteristic about mountains. And the verse goes as follows. "Did we not make the earth a resting place and the mountains as stakes?" And that passage, by the way, is taken from the Quran, Surah 78, verses 6 to 7. So the Quran indicates that mountains have deep roots by using the word stakes to describe them. Now, in fact, mountains do have deep roots, and the word stakes is a very accurate description for them. Now, there's a book entitled Earth by geophysicist Frank Press, and he explains that mountains are like stakes and are buried deep under the surface of the earth. Mount Everest, the height of which is approximately 9 kilometers above the ground, has a root deeper than 125 kilometers. Now the fact that mountains have deep stake-like roots was not known until after the development of the theory of plate tectonics in the beginning of the 20th century. Number 6 brings us the expansion of the universe. Now, at a time when science and astronomy was still primitive, the expansion of the universe was described actually in the Quran. And in the Quran, Surah 51 verse 47, it says, "And it is we who have built the universe with our creative power and keep expanding it." Now, the fact that the universe is expanding was discovered in the last century. Now, the physicist Stephen Hawking, in his book A Brief History of Time, writes, "The discovery that the universe is expanding was one of the great intellectual revolutions of the 20th century."
Astronomers think that the universe appears to be expanding at an accelerating rate.
Okay, so with that said, let's continue with this episode. At number 5, we have the sun's orbit. That's also mentioned in the Quran. So back in the year 1512 AD, the astronomer Nicholas Copernicus put forward his theory that the sun is motionless at the center of the solar system and that the planets revolve around it. Now, the belief that the sun is stationary was widespread amongst astronomers until the 20th century. It is now a well-established scientific fact that the sun is actually not stationary, but it's moving in an orbit around the center of our Milky Way galaxy. Now, the Quran actually mentions the orbit of the sun, and it goes as follows. "It is he who created night and day, the sun and the moon, each floating in its orbit." And you can find that in Surah 21, verses 33.
It was Galileo Galilei who in 1612 observed sunspots moving across the sun's disk over time, therefore confirming the sun's rotation.
We have at number 4 an interesting mention of embryology. So check this out. This passage goes as follows. "We created man from an extract of clay. Then we made him as a drop into a place of settlement, firmly fixed. Then we made the drop into an alaka." And that word, by the way, means leech, suspended thing, and blood clot. And then the passage continues as follows. "Then we made the alaka into mudga, which is a chewed substance." And that is found in the Quran, Surah 23, verses 12 to 24. Now, Professor Emeritus Keith L. Moore, he's one of the world's most prominent scientists in the field of anatomy and embryology. He said this, "It's clear to me that these statements must have come to Muhammad from God, because almost all of this knowledge was not discovered until many centuries later." At number 3, we have the seas and oceans. Modern science has discovered that in the places where two different seas meet, there's actually a barrier between them. I found this really, really fascinating. Now, this barrier divides two seas so that each sea has its own temperature, salinity, as well as its density. And there's a pretty surprising passage in the Quran that goes as follows. "He has set free the two seas meeting together. There is a barrier between them. They do not transgress." And that's in Surah 55, verses 19 to 20. Moving on now to number 2. We got 2 surprising things left to talk about. But number 2, we have skin pain receptors. For a long time, it was thought that the sense of feeling and pain was actually dependent on the brain. However, it's been discovered that there are pain receptors present in the skin. Without these pain receptors, a person would not even be able to feel pain anyways. Now, in the Quran, it says, "We shall send those who reject our revelations to the hellfire. When their skins have been burnt away, we shall replace them with new ones that they may continue to feel the pain. God is almighty, all-wise." And that's in Surah 4, verses 56. Now, in this episode, we've come to number 1, and we're going to be talking about lying and the frontal lobe. Now, there's actually a book titled Essentials of Anatomy and Physiology, which includes the results of research on the functions of this area, and it states, "The motivation and the foresight to plan and initiate movements occur in the anterior portion of the frontal lobes, the prefrontal area. The part of the brain that is responsible for movement is said to be seized if the man does not stop. Secondly, numerous studies have shown that the same region, the frontal lobe, is responsible for the lying function of the brain." There was, by the way, a very cruel and oppressive tribal leader known as Abu Jahl, who lived during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, and in the verses of the Quran, they read as followed. "No, indeed, if he does not stop, we will seize him by his forehead, his lying, sinful forehead." And you can find that in the Quran 96, verses 15 to 16. So as you can see there, Muslims point out that the Quran does not call this person a liar, but calls his forehead the frontal part of the brain lying and sinful and warns him to stop. Starting at number 10, we have hypoxia, which is a lack of oxygen. Now, at high altitudes, the oxygen concentration in the atmosphere decreases. Now, when the oxygen levels drops, the blood vessels in the lungs constrict. Hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction, or HPV, is a physiological phenomenon in which small pulmonary arteries constrict in the presence of alveolar hypoxia, which is low oxygen levels. Now, the blood vessels in the lungs, they constrict when the oxygen levels drop. So this was only known recently. However, Muslims believe that this was actually described in the Quran 1400 years ago before it was discovered by modern scientists. In the Quran, Surah 6, verses 125, it says, "So whoever Allah wants to guide, He expands his chest to contain Islam. And whoever He wants to misguide, He makes his chest tight and constricted as though they were climbing into the sky. Thus does Allah place defilement upon those who do not believe." And at number 9, we have gender. That's found in the Quran as well, how gender is produced. So the father determines the sex of a baby, right? And now the females have the XX chromosomes. And that is that they can only give one X chromosome. But since males have X and Y chromosomes, then men can either give X or Y chromosomes. This means that it is actually the males who determine the sex of a newborn baby by giving either an X or Y chromosomes. Now in the Quran, Surah 53, verses 45 to 46, it says, "And He, Allah, creates pairs, male and female, from sperm emitted." So the Quran states that it is the sperm that determines whether the baby is male or female. But since sperm only comes from the males, this means that it is males who determine the sex of the baby. And it's also very surprising to note that the verse number 46 is the same number of chromosomes that humans have. 23 pairs equal 46 total. Another surprising thing that Muslims highlight from the Quran is the full moon. To have a full moon, the sun, the earth, and the moon have to be aligned. So the full moon occurs at a precise moment in time. So it's the instant when the sun and the moon are aligned on opposite sides of the earth. Now the full moon is only visible from sunset to sunrise because Earth is of course a sphere, so it's impossible for people in the daytime to see the full moon. So they have to wait for the Earth to rotate so that they are facing the full moon. But you see, this was only recently discovered, and in the Quran, Surah 84, verses 16 to 18, it says, "I swear by the twilight, and by the night, and what covers it, and by the moon, as it grows full." At number 7, the surprising thing found in the Quran is miscarriage. So the researchers have known that during times of stress, the brain releases several hormones, including this one called corticotropin. Now, they're releasing this hormone, which is known as CRH. Now, research suggests that CRH, as well as other stress hormones, may also be released everywhere in the body where it specifically targets localized mast cells. And during stress, the local release of CRH, they cause these mast cells to secrete substances that can cause miscarriages. And now in the Quran, Surah 22 verses 2, it says, "On the day you see it, every nursing mother will be distracted from that child she was nursing, and every pregnant woman will abort her pregnancy, and you will see the people appearing intoxicated while they are not intoxicated. But the punishment of Allah is severe." White hair comes in at number 6. Now, the big question is, can your hair turn white as a result of being totally shocked? Well, in theory, any sudden shock or accident or illness or change in metabolism could make your hair change color, but it won't be visible right away. Now, according to one doctor, Dr. John O'Connor, he's the head of the School of Physical Science and Mathematics at the University of Newcastle in Australia. He says, once your hair has grown out of its follicle, any emotional or physical trauma will not affect it. This hair is basically dead, like your nails. Yet severe adverse events could cause new hair that grows out a few weeks later to be white. And it's found in the Quran, Surah 73 verses 17, this passage. "So how will you, if you persist in unbelief, save yourself from a day which will turn the children white-haired?" At number 5, we have mass extinction. So this is a pretty loaded one. So dinosaurs, it's believed by most scientists that they got extinct when the massive meteor or asteroid hit the Earth. Now, on the impact, there's smoke and dust that covered the entire world. And now the comet itself didn't actually hit the dinosaurs, but rather it was the smoke and the dust that blocked the sunlight, which triggered a series of unfortunate devastating events. Now, in the 3-page document written by Richard Cohen, University of California at Berkeley, the KT extinction in 1999, you'll find a detailed report and explanation talking about what happened after that impact. But it was just the smoke, not the dust, which caused the acid rain that killed the plants and the animals. Now, it's said that there are mountains in heaven that have ice inside them. Those mountains could fall on earth, making a very bright flash. And the following verse is found in the Quran, Surah 24, verses 43. Can't you see that Allah makes the clouds move gently, then joins them together, then makes them into a pile? Then you see rain come out from within, and he sends down from heaven mountains with ice inside them that strike whoever he wishes or misses whoever he wishes. Its flash almost blinds you. Now, the chapter, the smoke in the Quran, is believed to describe the smoke that resulted. And you can see in the Quran, Surah 44, verses 9 to 10, it says, "So watch out for the day when the sky brings prevailing smoke, enveloping mankind. This is a painful torture." Another surprising thing in the Quran is the spider's web. So it's generally accepted that adult female spiders build the typical webs, while adult males do not build webs. They, however, reserve that for mating purposes. And in the Quran, you'll find this verse in Surah 29, verse 41. "The likeness of those who take to themselves protectors other than Allah is that of the spider. It builds a house, but the most fragile of houses is a spider's house." There's also a surprising mention about pairs in the Quran. Up until about 100 years ago, it was thought that only man and animals were made in pairs. Female animals, male animals. However, the Quran said that everything from which the land produces, humans and what they could not see, were also made in pairs. So today we know that all matter is actually in pairs. Matter and antimatter, electrons, positrons, all of that stuff. Now in the Quran, Surah 36, verses 36, it says, "Glory to him, Allah, who created in pairs all things that the land produces, and their own kind, humans, and other things that they have no knowledge of." The next surprising thing mentioned in the Quran at number 2 is antioxidants. The antioxidants found in pomegranates as well as dates, they help the heart from suffering from heart attacks. Now, there is an Israeli study that showed that regular consumption of pomegranate juice and dates actually prevent this. Researchers at the Technion Israel Institute of Technology have found that half a glass of juice a day, along with 3 dates, can bring about a significant reduction of the accumulation of fatty cells in arteries, which can cause heart attacks and strokes. Now, according to a study published in the British scientific journal Food and Function, the scientists tested the effects of fruits on mice as well as on arterial cells that were grown in a laboratory. And they found that when used regularly, the combination of antioxidants contained within pomegranates and dates could actually lower cholesterol in the arteries by 28%. Now, Muslims have brought to light that it's found in the Quran in Surah 55, verses 68. It says, "In them are the fruits, the dates, palms, and pomegranates." And finally, the number one surprising thing in this episode mentioned in the Quran is the eye pupil. So random, but it's there. So lying usually involves some level of tension or anxiety, unless you're a very good liar, right? Because honestly, you might be so worried and concerned to some degree that you're going to be found out to be a liar. So this tension subconsciously triggers a sympathetic nervous system, which will cause certain effects throughout your body. Sympathetic stimulation to the eye will cause contraction of the radially oriented pupillary dilator muscle fibers in the iris and will result in mydriasis, which is dilation of the pupil. Now, an opposite effect is actually achieved when the eye receives parasympathetic stimulation, meaning when you're calmer and you're probably confessing the truth or something. The pupil actually undergoes what's called meiosis or constriction. Now, in the Quran, it said in Surah 40, verse 19, "He knows the betrayal of the eyes." Coming up at number 10, we have anxiety. Now, it says in the Quran that indeed mankind was created anxious. Now, this has a lot of meaning that's put into it, and one of the most important meanings is that according to Muslims, Allah actually created humans for paradise but brought us to earth. And this means that humans are in an environment that is not actually normal for them. Therefore, humans go through a wide range of different emotions in this world. While there are positive emotions that humans feel, there are also emotions like anxiety as well as sadness that we experience. So I thought that was pretty fascinating. But coming up next at number 9, psychology. That's talked about in the Quran as well. Specifically in the Quran, Surah 5 verses 30, it says, "So that nafs, or self, of the other, latter one, encouraged him and made fair seeming to him the murder of his brother. He murdered him and became one of the losers." Now, the Quran describes what's called the nafs, or the selves, as operating out of one of 3 states. There's the nafs al-amara, which is the commanding self. Then there's the nafs al-alawama, which is the accusatory self. And then thirdly, there's the nafs al-mutmainna. That is the peaceful self. Now, the Quran explains how these states actually command our psyche and tells us what to do. They control us, they dominate us, and now when our emotional needs are being poorly met, the nafs al-amara begins to control our feelings. But on top of that, the thoughts and the behaviors are also controlled by this as well. And the Quran provides guidance to learn and practice relaxation exercises to weaken the influence of the nafs, or selves. So there we see in the Quran, there's psychology mentioned there. Hope is another surprising thing that is mentioned in the Quran, and the Quran recognizes various types of hope. Specifically, it says, "And they, the people of the book, said, none will enter paradise unless he be a Jew or a Christian. Those are their false hopes." And that's in the Quran, Surah 2, verses 111. Now, there's a term called omniyatun, and those are hopes that lack practical basis in reality and have very little chance of actually becoming real. Sort of like wishful thinking. Then there's wad, and that's a hope of attaining something which is motivated by the love of a certain thing or a person. Now, it can have a positive connotation or a negative connotation based on the circumstances and the context. Like, for example, in the Quran, Surah 15, verses 2, it says, "Perhaps those who disbelieve will wish that they had been Muslim." So that's speaking of a type of hope in a negative connotation. So I also thought that this was pretty fascinating because, obviously hope is linked to religion, but hope being broken down into multiple types of hopes, I didn't expect to see that in the Quran, so that's what I included in this episode. Now, coming at number 7, we have affection and mercy, also stuff that are related to religion in general. But check this out. The Quran says this, "And of his signs is that he created for you from yourselves mates, that you may find tranquility in them. And he placed between you affection and mercy. Indeed, in that are signs for a people who give thought." And that's in the Quran, Surah 30, verses 21. So in this verse, we see God regards the creation of spouses as a sign. And in order to find peace and harmony between two of them, the verses say God himself placed affection and mercy between them so that they can live a life of tranquility. Now, the relationship between the spouses is based on affection and mercy. Another surprising thing mentioned in the Quran is sex. So sex has been openly recommended in the Quran. As a matter of fact, Surah 2 verses 222 says this, "When they," which is referring to the wives, "have cleansed themselves after menstruation, you go into them as Allah has commanded." Now, one thing to point out though is that the phrase commanded, it actually doesn't refer to a legislative command or anything like that. And what I mean by that, it's like it doesn't mean that as soon as somebody's wife becomes clean when she's off her period, that you need to immediately go and lay with her. No. But rather, it's referring to the sexual urges inside of human nature. Quran says God put those there, and you gotta use the urges as intended. So yeah, I'll just end that point there in an effort to just make this video as appropriate as possible. Definitely don't want to offend anyone or have this video get flagged on YouTube. Continuing at number 5, we have parents. As for the children, who are the fruits of their parents' love, inside of Islam, it lays down a comprehensive moral structure that enjoins parental responsibility and the child's duty to their parents. The Quran specifically says, "And treat your parents with kindness if one or both of them attain old age in your care. Never say to them a word suggesting disgust, nor reproach them, but address them with reverent speech. And humble yourself out of mercy before them and pray, my Lord, be merciful to them for having cared for me in my childhood. And you can find that in Surah 17 verses 23 onward. Also, do you know that equality is mentioned in the Quran? So yeah, one of the most misunderstood areas in Islam actually is the position of women in the religion. Now, the general perception in the West is that Muslim women are actually subjugated and almost seen as property to men. Now, while not all Muslims deal with women as inferior, this unfortunately is true in some parts of the Muslim world, and this treatment is supposedly justified by the religion. However, in the Quran itself, it states that men and women are equal. Period. In Surah 49 verses 13 it says, O mankind, indeed we have created you from male and female and made you peoples and tribes that you may know one another. Indeed, the most noble of you in the sight of Allah is the most righteous of you. Indeed, Allah is all-knowing and acquainted. So in the Quran, there you go. Mankind is male, female, man, woman. Nobody's better, nobody's above anyone. Definitely men and women are different, we're made differently, but men don't own women, women don't own men. Number 3, we have the mention of patience. Now, patience is mentioned in the Quran in 90 places. Patience is made a condition of success and prosperity in the Quran, and specifically the Quran says, O you who believe, persevere and endure and remain stationed and fear Allah that you may be successful. And that's found in the Quran, Surah 3 verses 200. So yeah, it's definitely true. In every area of your life that you are successful in, there is a state of patience that you need to go through first. Number 2 is actually the mention of humanity. So check this, the Quran places a lot of emphasis on the oneness of human beings and introduces the idea of common human origin and ancestry at 4 different places. And it says that humans actually have their origin in a single cell or soul. Now, to quote from the Quran, it says, O mankind, reverence your guardian Lord who created you from a single soul, created of like nature, the mate, and from them twain scattered like seeds, countless men and women. Reverence Allah through whom you demand your mutual rights, and reverence the wombs that bore you, for Allah ever watches over you. And you can find that in Surah 4 verses 1. So that also kind of ties into the mention of equality of men and women as well. But either way, the last surprising thing that I want to share in this episode that's mentioned in the Quran is forgiveness. Now, forgiveness teaches a person patience and makes a person better for it, as well as stronger and more steadfast in their goals because they don't care what life throws their way. Also, another interesting point is that forgiveness is an attribute that God uses the most generously found in the Quran. Now, it's mentioned in the Quran in a number of places. Specifically, one verse says, and let not those of virtue among you and wealth swear not to give aid to their relatives and the needy and the immigrants for the cause of Allah, and let them pardon and overlook. Would you not like that Allah should forgive you? And Allah is forgiving and merciful. And that's found in the Quran, Surah 24, verses 22.